Hello and welcome on behalf of the Sousa Mendez Foundation. I am Olivia Mattis, president of the foundation, and I'm so glad you've given us some of your Sunday today. Our program today is on the theme of Let My People Go, which is, of course, a theme that's very apt for Passover that's coming up in just a few days. And it's a theme that goes all the way back, obviously, to biblical times and up to the present day when we still are praying every day for those hostages that are in Hamas captivity. Let My People Go is a theme that seems to be always with us, and it's the yearning for freedom that resonates so strongly with all other communities around the world that have been oppressed. So I asked my dear friend Dr. Shulamit Reinhartz to moderate today's program because she's a specialist in unknown stories of Jewish women's history. So I'm so glad that Shula said yes. She even brought us one of today's speakers. So Shula, I turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Olivia, and it's great to see people here. I don't want to be a sexist, but I see there's a lot of women here, and this is a show that will perhaps inspire you to think about ways that you could do things that relate to what these great women did, because they are, not to say that anybody here is exactly like those women, but you are close in many ways. So we have a perfect triangle, not a perfect storm, a perfect triangle today with three speakers, and I'm going to tell you who they are. We have Roger Childs. Roger Childs will be our first speaker, and he has the role of making this film a reality. He is not one of the 35ers. I don't know if he even went to the Soviet Union at any point, but he wanted to make this film. And this is how he describes his background. I have been working in broadcasting for 36 years. 1836 is also a great number for us. For any of you who are Jews, you know that's a double high, and there's 36 righteous people in the world. I hope that includes some of you. 18 years in Ireland's national public service broadcaster, which is called RTE with an accent aigu. 16 years at the BBC, 2 years in the UK independent sector, making content mainly for Channel 4. And once upon a time, he even did an internship at WNET in New York. What's interesting, besides his range of affiliations, public service, profit making, etc., he says he has worked across a wide range of content and genre in TV, radio, print, and online. For 34 years, he has focused on religious content. And this is not in the role of preacher. This is the role of teacher who's trying to get people to understand what the role of religion is in people's life. He is not a theologian. He's not trying to convert anybody, but what he's trying to do is focus on this one topic, which I love because it's so profound and also written in such a colloquial way. He wants to have people have his films and his shows focus on the things people do and the stuff they believe to give life meaning. So we will hear from Roger Childs very soon. Our second speaker, also an amazing person, is Sharon Rosen. Sharon Rosen is very, very frequently labeled the wife of the chief rabbi of Ireland, and I'm sure that is a label that she is very proud of, being a real partner to her husband and he to her. But she has some additional achievements of her own, which are so important. She is the former global director of religious engagement at the Search for Common Ground, the world's largest non-governmental organization dedicated to peace building. In other words, her activism did not end with the release of Jews from the Soviet Union. She is featured in the film that you saw, Iron Ladies, as one of the activists in the group The 35s. She is a resident of Israel for the past 43 years, a facilitator in interreligious programming and advancing religious freedom and reconciliation. She worked with field officers in over 20 countries. She co created, and listen to this, she co created the Universal Code of Conduct on Holy Sites for the protection of sacred spaces. And for the past 8 years, she has directed a Jewish Muslim religious leaders initiative to expand peaceful relations among Jewish and Muslims in Israel. I'm sure you're already fascinated and want to hear everything that Sharon has done. And our last speaker, I am proud to say, is a personal friend. I hope Roger and Sharon will be my personal friends after this show. Jana was born in Leningrad and lived in Leningrad for many years. And in 1981, in part because of the work of people like Sharon and the films by people like Roger, in 1981, she was able to leave the Soviet Union. In 1982, she arrived in the United States, specifically in Texas, which is, I think, a good introduction to the United States. And in 1983, she came to Brandeis University, where I was teaching, but I was not teaching what she was teaching. She was teaching neuroscience. Well, she is a neuroscientist specializing in human factors in space flight. For example, the only example I have of what this means is Jana studies people who are in zero gravity, floating around, and her office was right below mine. So I was kind of floating around in my activities, and she was floating around in hers. In 1982, I was asked by somebody to give a Dvar Torah, a talk, at Rosh Hashanah services. And I think what happened was the next year, 1983, when Jana came, she was asked to give a talk. And my talk since have been inspired by Jana's, and she claims somehow that I was an inspiration for her. So you see, we have the filmmaker, we have the member of the original 35s, and we have a person who was saved by them. So I think now I would like to turn the show over to Roger. But before I do that, I just want to show you 3 slides. This is a slide of the Helsinki Accords that were signed by President Gerald Ford and General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev. It is an agreement between the US and the USSR with 33 other signatories, all of whom we probably don't remember. I think it's a wonderful slide to show you a decisive moment in the Freedom for Soviet Jewry Act. But I want you to notice that everybody there is a man, and that the role of women over and over has been diminished. I like men. I'm married to one. I have a grandson, but this is a problem in Jewish history. Here we have the Soviet embassy in London with the bicycle protest by British women who are riding bicycles and not just sort of sitting at home. They all have a necklace on with a symbol. They're all young. They're not all 35 years old, though. The 35 was the average age. They are doing it as a group, not as the individual. They are smiling. They are not threatening. And they have a very simple message, the message like we have today about releasing the hostages. And the next slide, please. Here is one woman, now 88 years old, and this was taken 2 years ago. and she was one of the original 35s. I think she not only did a lot for the movement, but I think the movement did a lot for her, looking at her smile. And now I'd like to turn the camera over to Roger Childs and would like to ask him two questions separated. The first one is, tell us a little bit about what you did in preparation for making this film. Who did you talk to? How did you even get to this topic? So, who are you and what have you done here?
Well, thank you, Sheila, and thank you for your introduction. Um, I think who I am doesn't really matter, particularly after you've just said that women have played an unsung role. It would be wrong to start singing about the man's role this evening. The first thing I need to say is that this film was actually not made by me. It was made by a brilliant young Irish woman director called Aoife Kelleher. Unfortunately, because of family illness at the moment, she's not available to join us this evening.
Thank
But
you.
this is a film made by a woman about women. What was my role? I'm a commissioning editor and an executive producer. And I think probably about 7 years ago, the rabbi of the South Dublin Hebrew congregation, Zalman Lent, told me this story about these amazing women. I'd never heard this story before.
I
Um,
hadn't either.
and he said that at the peak of the Cold War, a group of young Irish mums and housewives decided that they couldn't do nothing in the face of tyranny and oppression for their fellow religionists in the Soviet Union. Now, think back to what was going on then. This is a time when people were being shot when they tried to cross the Berlin Wall. This was a time when women, by and large, were seen as irrelevant to the whole political sphere. They were assumed to have no political power or influence. And yet, these brilliant, resourceful, creative women decided, no, we're not going to do nothing. So initially, a group in London, founded by Barbara Oberman Katz and Doreen Gainsford, and Sylvia Wallace was a very early recruit, decided that they would mount a protest. That's how it started, a protest movement, in defense of a single Soviet woman, actually a Ukrainian Jewish woman called Raisa Palatnik, who had started to learn Hebrew, started to collect materials about Israel, and was embracing her Judaism in a way that her family hadn't been able to do up till that point. Somebody shocked her to the authorities. Her flat was raided, these things were found, and that was enough to place her into incarceration and actually into solitary confinement. However, word got to London to this group of women who all thought, she's our age, she's us. And a lot of them actually had Russian Jewish origins. You know, that's their sort of immigrant path. So they decided she was 35 years old, and they said, let's 35 of us go to the Soviet embassy and spend 35 hours in hunger strike and protest and see if that does anything. And by the end of those 35 hours, two things had happened. Firstly, a relative of hers who was living in London said that her parents had been contacted, and for the first time, they were going to be allowed to visit her. So that's victory number one. Secondly, because they were phoning so many journalists and trying to promote their cause, eventually one of those journalists said, oh, it's those 35s on the phone again. And they got a name. So you're quite right. They weren't all 35. That was an average. But at that point, they became unstoppable. Nothing succeeds like success. And I think there were a number of people who started spreading the word about this London group of women. The word reached Dublin, and that's where the story of the Dublin 35s, and SHARON ROSEN will be taking over from me on that later on. That's where that story began, but it sprouted in cities in 9 different countries, initially as a protest movement, petitioning politicians, but also they started trying to find out via Russian speakers, writing letters, making telephone calls relentlessly, what is happening to those refusenik Jews in the Soviet Union. They paired their children's bar and bat mitzvot. so that there was a personal connection with all of these people. They sent supplies until they realized that the supplies weren't always getting through. And then, as you say, 1975, the Helsinki Accords changed things so that for the first time, people were able to travel to the Soviet Union. Revolutionary. Suddenly, there was the possibility of going there, pretending to be tourists and making personal, direct connection with these people who, prior to that, had been imprisoned, persecuted, oppressed. And at that point, there was first-hand knowledge, first-hand engagement, and relationships formed. And I'm delighted that Sharon Rosen has been able to join us because she's one of those who actually went to the Soviet Union. Again, think of this. This is the peak of the Cold War, when it was a very uncertain and fearful experience to go to this country. And they weren't John le Carré-esque spies, and yet here they were operating clandestinely behind the so-called Iron Curtain. And their activism, their sort of thoroughfare of information, back and forth, informing politicians, informing journalists, helped to establish the human rights, helped to force the Soviet Union to live up to the promises of Helsinki. And that, chip by chip by chip, led to Gorbachev in 1989 saying, enough, okay, we'll let my people go, as you said. It's a Passover theme.
That's right. Like the Pharaoh
There
who
you go.
finally let them go, but
And
then
that phrase
turned.
was used in Hebrew and English in many different countries as a sort of motto for the oppressed Soviet Jews
Right,
and for the
but
35s.
just like the Pharaoh changed his mind and went after the Jews as they were trying to cross the Red Sea. I think that it's not as if the former Soviet Union was suddenly a free place, but
No,
it was freer, it would seem to
it's
me.
not a simple Pesach.
It never is. So let's hear now from Sharon,
Okay.
who is one of the, I'm not exaggerating here, one of the Moses figures, like Junior Moses, one of these people who says you can go. You can go to the Soviet Union, and then you're going to be able to go out of the Soviet Union. Go ahead.
Thank you, Shola. I think a little exaggerated, if you don't mind my saying so, but thank you for that introduction. And I also want to thank the Susa Mendes Foundation for inviting me to join this webinar today. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you, but especially for two main reasons. First of all, I think the 35 story is one worth retelling to reach a much wider audience. So thank you, Roger, and the RTE team for doing it so beautifully. And secondly, it has really brought back vivid memories from over 40 years ago that I thought were forgotten and buried. So thank you for taking me down a trip down memory lane. I wasn't aware of the efforts of the 35s when I arrived in Dublin, Ireland at the end of 1979 from South Africa, together with my husband, David, who'd been appointed as Chief Rabbi of Ireland, and I came with our two daughters. So here's a picture of us there as just after we arrived at the beginning of 1980. Of course, I knew about the plight of Soviet Jewry. That was well known within the Jewish world, but not the grassroots role that Jewish women specifically were taking upon themselves in the UK and Ireland, and I've just heard from Roger, in various other countries as well. But I learned quite quickly. We participated in a candlelight vigil with the 35s on the steps of the Russian embassy in Dublin in December 1981, which was about 6 weeks before our third daughter was born in Ireland. This was Hanukkah time in front on the steps of the Soviet embassy in Dublin. It was important for us to get the story out to the wider Irish community and even internationally, so that efforts were not just seen as an internal Jewish story. We wanted to put more and more pressure on the Soviet Union. So this article that you're seeing now, part of it, in the Irish Times, which was Ireland's daily national paper, is a good example of that. It was published immediately following the vigil, and a petition that had been created calling on the Soviet Union to free Jews. The plight of Soviet Jews is described in the article, and it's also linked to government efforts through the Helsinki Agreement, the award that we heard before, to pressurize the Soviets to enable greater religious freedom. I'd like to, on the next slide, to show you a photo of my friend Lynn Jackson, who was very active in the 35s and also visited the Soviet Union in 1984. She's here with Tanya Edelstein, whose husband Yuli was one of the last refuseniks to be freed and given permission to emigrate to Israel. And I mention him because he later became a very prominent Israeli politician, holding ministerial positions. He was Speaker of the Knesset for 7 years, and even now is in the government as Chairman of the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. And so now I get to my personal story with the 35s. I received a visit near the end of 1983 from a representative of the Israeli embassy in London, because there was no Israeli embassy in Ireland at the time, whom we nicknamed the Spy. He asked me if I would visit refuseniks in the Soviet Union, Leningrad specifically. Duos were going there to take in goods, check on the accuracy of information and bring it out, as well as give support to the refuseniks. I would have liked to have gone with David, with my husband, who would have loved to have gone with me, but his position was too prominent, and they were sending people with low profiles as so-called tourists so as not to draw attention. I traveled with Myra Glass, who you can see in the slide with me, from the Jewish community, whom I didn't know that well beforehand, but we certainly returned as very good friends. In this photo, you can see us in Leningrad. I'm wearing a thick winter coat that Lynn, who I mentioned previously, lent me. I think the thing I was most concerned about before this trip was actually the cold. I suffer from it very badly then and now. And as you can see from the snow all around, I wasn't wrong. It was pretty cold when we were there. So the Spy gave us names and addresses of people to contact. Our task was to check that the information he gave us was correct and to take in a very expensive camera, which we were told to lose. I give to a refusenik who would sell it to support those who didn't have an income. We also took in some kosher food. I remember soup cubes for smuggling into prison. As an aside, actually, our Spy and his family turned out to be close neighbors of ours in Jerusalem when we returned to live there in 1985. And his daughter was actually in the same class as our daughter in the school. So really a small world. The week before we traveled to Leningrad, which was it was around this time, it was a few weeks before Pesach, a British couple had been deported from the Soviet Union. So our main concern was how to arrive unnoticed and bring in the names and addresses so that they wouldn't be found on us, as we couldn't possibly remember all those long Russian names. We came up with a brainwave. Do you remember the old powder compacts we used to use over 40 years ago? Well, between the powder in its plastic holder and the metal casing, there was just enough room to fit in a piece of paper with all the information, and it wasn't detected when we went in. We stayed in a hotel that had a woman sitting day and night at a desk on every floor, watching the comings and goings of the guests. And we knew the rooms were bugged and the telephones were tapped. So we were very careful. We had to say something, if we had to say something to each other about refuseniks, we'd go into the bathroom, turn on the tap and whisper a few words. But mostly we did everything outside, including a lot of walking and using public phone boxes. We visited refuseniks in their homes, secret classrooms with teachers teaching Hebrew to students, and we visited the synagogue as well. Generally, we found Leningrad to be a most beautiful city. It was difficult to associate this beauty with the ugliness within, not just suffered actually by the Jewish community, but more widely, and more of that shortly. I like to share one vignette which remains strongly in my mind. We were invited to the home of Rabbi Yitzhak Kogan and his wife Sophia for Friday night Shabbat dinner. He was known, although he was not formally a rabbi yet, he was known as the Rabbi of Leningrad and was also the shochet, the ritual slaughterer. So the Jewish community had meat to eat. He was an engineer by profession, but was not allowed to work in that field and earned his living by fixing fridges and other household appliances. We were greeted with warmth and friendship, although I think they were expecting me to look a bit different as the wife of the chief rabbi, quite a bit older, maybe with a head covering. At the table, we had wine and we broke bread for the meal. And then Sophia started bringing out the food from the kitchen. Filter fish for the first course, chicken and meat for the second, but nothing else. Now, I'd become a vegetarian several years previously. I'm actually now a vegan, and eating fish and meat was like eating non-kosher for me. I just couldn't get myself to do it, but I didn't want to offend them or their hospitality in any way. To return to the problems in Leningrad, there was almost no fresh food, fruits, or vegetables available in the shops for the local people. I remember long queues every day as people waited for hours to buy a loaf of bread and any other provisions that they could. Anyway, suddenly Sophia smiled at me and ran into the kitchen. She returned with her hands outstretched as if in prayer, and in her palms was an orange, which truly was a gift at that time of scarcity. So that is what I ate for my Shabbat dinner, bread and an orange, and it was really more than enough. The Kogans were also finally allowed to leave the Soviet Union later that year. Here you see them in this slide visiting the US in 1986 to meet with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was their spiritual leader. One final story. When we arrived at Leningrad airport, entering Leningrad, an inventory had been taken of everything we bought in, including the expensive camera, which would be checked on our departure. We decided on a story to explain how it was lost, but we were worried, to put it mildly. However, just before it was our turn to be checked, a woman in front of us was stopped. Her bags were opened and searched, and she was detained for questioning. In all the kerfuffle, we managed to slip through unnoticed. God was clearly on our side that day. So even though we were a bit sorry for the woman in front of us, we were definitely very relieved when we got on the flight to return home. So that's my story, and I hand it over to Jana, I think, or maybe to you, Shula, to continue.
No, it's fine to give it to Jenna. Now we see the other side of the coin. And I'd like to open the floor to you, Jenna.
Thank you. Thank you, the Susan Mendes Foundation, for inviting me, Shula, of course, and all of you for getting together to celebrate this release of the film. I want to just start with what this whole session started. Let my people go, as you, Olivia, said in the beginning, and you, Shula. We knew that phrase, of course, as refuseniks in the Soviet Union, but it was only when I finally was let go and came to the West that I learned the whole sentence, that biblical sentence, the second half of it. Let my people go so that they can serve me, said the Lord. That purpose for freedom. Freedom has a purpose. And that was something really that became my lifeline since my emigration, to find that purpose, to become somebody, to do something with this freedom. Freedom comes with responsibility. I wonder why we only all know the first half of the sentence and forget the second. With this in mind, let me go back to my refusenik days. I actually was one of the beneficiaries of the 35s. I started receiving letters from a lady from London, Mrs. Zinkin, and that correspondence was really a sustaining factor. Refuseniks, social isolation of refuseniks was massive. We were shunned by our former friends, by our former colleagues, often even by family members who didn't want to be associated. So letters from people who cared for our well-being were very important. And I started correspondence with Mrs. Zinkin, not knowing about the magnitude of that organization. The 35s, I thought it was just a bunch of English or Irish housewives who get together for tea and, do some social conversations and write letters. It was only when I actually saw this film, The Iron Ladies, that I realized that they were a powerful organization. They were a force of nature. They were part of the human rights movement, many movements, several organizations who in the aggregate were saving lives. I was quite impressed to learn so much about them just within the last few weeks, having been one of the beneficiaries of their work. This slide is really a photograph of my community, refusenik community in Leningrad. I'm not in it. I was taking this picture. But the Kogan family that Sharon mentioned, the two girls in the bottom row on the left are the daughters of Yitzhak and Sofa Kogan. And that family, I was extremely close to them. I took care of their girls when they were detained by police or had to hide. The youngest, Sima, was such a darling charge of mine that when my own daughter was born already here in 1990, I called her Sima because I loved that name and that whole connection. The reason I put this picture is just to show you the contrast between the beauty, the normalcy, openness of these people and the perverse attitude towards them of persecution and harassment and tortures that they were subjected to just because they were Jews and because they wanted to immigrate to Israel. They committed no crime. The Helsinki Accord gave the legal framework for the Soviet Jews to apply for immigration. And yet they were treated as enemies of the people. And they were harassed, children, adults, elderly alike. And to me, they were my family. They were my community. We sustained each other. In the next slide is one of our cultural events in the refusenik community. We really created a very vibrant network of ulpanim, Hebrew classes, of social gatherings, study sessions, science seminars for fired scientists. And we had Purim Spiel. The Queen Esther here is actually the oldest daughter of Yitzhak Kogan, and that was staged in their home. And in the next picture is actually the complete picture of that Purim Spiel, where you can see Yitzhak Kogan and me on the left. My maiden name was Lipmanov at that time. Next slide actually was taken in June of 1981 when I was finally given a permission to emigrate. And at my ulpan, at my Hebrew study group, which all of those things were underground, you see. They were in somebody's apartments. And prior to those events, like the Purim Spiel or Erev Shabbat meal or a study group, we would put some of our members of our community as sentinels on corners, street corners around the house where we would meet to see if there are police or KGB raids so that they can give us advance notice and we can fold our activity. So this was my farewell a week before I left the Soviet Union. And this is my ulpan, my Hebrew teacher. And the three women on the right are the mother, Eleonora, and her daughters, Olga and Tanya, who were refuseniks. Their father was arrested and imprisoned at that time. And yet we were able to enjoy, to celebrate. We had the power and the agency to do things, to really overcome our persecution and suffering, to create a life full of meaning. And then in the next picture is my first photograph when I left the Soviet Union that was taken in Vienna, where all Soviet Jews would land upon egress. And the reason I put this picture in is that physically I probably was free, but the fear of what's behind me, of what is, behind my back, what is happening, that constant being on guard hasn't left me for quite a while. It would take years. And my first job was at the University of Texas. So I moved to Austin, Texas in 1982. It took me a year to be processed by HIAS and joined the services, Jewish services that process Jews for the United States. Before I went to Texas, I went to Paris, where I was received by Comité de 15. The Committee of 15 was the French organization who adopted me, much like the 35s in England and Ireland. But the Committee of 15 only had 15 refuseniks whom they adopted at the time. So the relationship with them was much closer. They sent people and correspondence, and they really knew every one of their adoptees very, very keenly. They knew my life and my situation in detail. And when I came out of the Soviet Union, they brought me to Paris, and there were many events there. And it's through them that Mrs. Zinkin, the 35er, found how to connect me, and I met her in Paris for lunch. So that was the first time that I saw a 35er in person. Prior to that, it was just letters. And in the next slide is the congressman from Texas, Jake Pickle, who learned from my lab director and from me about refuseniks. And during his congressional trip to the Soviet Union, which included Leningrad, he met with refuseniks of Leningrad. And this is my community. If I was still there a year later in 1982, I would have been in this picture as well. I know every one of those refuseniks. They were close friends. Some of them were in prison after that. There are 2 or 3 people who were in prison for several years after that, but all of them eventually left when the Soviet Union fell apart. And Pickle wasn't Jewish, but he took the cause to his heart and was very influential in helping Soviet Jews. And when Jake Pickle event took place in Austin, and seeing that photograph, I screamed, I know these people. Then a reporter came to me from the Austin American Statesman to interview me, and I had all those photographs, some of which I showed to you in front of me, and reminisced and shared my experience, bondage to freedom and everything in between. So the beginning of my success story started at about that time. And it is an incredible story. So many years have passed, and I'm deeply happy that this film came out about the 35s. At the same time, incidentally or coincidentally, the Committee of 15 is creating their own history of the movement, and they are publishing a book of history of the Committee, the 15, and I was asked to write an essay for that. That will be coming out in a few months. It's remarkable that we are now thinking again about those heroes, both the refusenik heroes and the heroes in the West and in Israel who saved our lives.
Thank you, Jana. So, audience, I'm going to give you the next few minutes to continue putting your many questions into the chat box. There's so many things that I'm sure all of you want to ask. I'm just going to tell you very briefly about what we have upcoming here at the Suzanne Mendes Foundation, and then Shulamit Reinhartz will moderate your questions. So we're taking a break now for the holidays, for Passover, for Easter. And we will reconvene on May 4th, Sunday, May 4th. And that program tells another very fascinating story, totally different subject, but all the same themes. And on that day, we are focusing on the American hero. His name was Fred Korematsu. Who was Fred Korematsu? He was a Japanese American. He was born in the United States. And even though he was an American citizen, he was told to report during World War II to be incarcerated as an enemy alien. And these are stories that resonate yet again with what's going on today. So what Fred Korematsu did that was so courageous as a young man of 20 or whatever he was to actually say no. He said, I'm an American. The Constitution applies equally to me. I will not be incarcerated. And he took his case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, if you can believe it. 1944, the United States Supreme Court voted against him, voted that there was a military reason to incarcerate all of these Japanese Americans. It's a very shameful decision in the history of the US Supreme Court. So he had lost numerous civil rights, which he didn't gain again until the 1980s when his case was reopened. And it was that 1980s case that then reversed that the shame of the Korematsu case of the 1944 case. And that case in the 1980s granted him a victory and also granted reparations for all Japanese Americans that had been incarcerated by the Roosevelt administration during World War II. And then 10 years after that, Korematsu was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom, all for the same act. So we're telling his breathtaking story on May 4th. And now we're going to see a little trailer of the film of Civil Wrongs and Rights.
We expect the worst to happen, and it did. Curfew notices were posted on the telephone poles. And then after that, about a week or so, the notice for the evacuation.
I didn't think that the government would go as far as to include American citizens to be interned without a hearing. And then later on, they changed my draft card to 4C, which is enemy alien. In those days, if you're an Asian, people automatically think you don't belong in this country. You're not an American. And I thought that was wrong. After I was arrested, and I went there and I lied on the cot and I said,
Gee, jail was a lot better than this.
In 1942, an ordinary American took an extraordinary stand. Fred Korematsu boldly opposed the forced internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. After being convicted for failing to report for relocation, Mr. Korematsu took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. The High Court ruled against him.
Fred Korematsu's case represented the trial that Japanese Americans never had. This was an entire population that, without evidence, without trial, without due process of any kind, were simply swept into internment camps, many losing their property, some even losing their lives.
The real significance of Fred's case is that it raised, for the first time, the central issue. Was the internment itself constitutional?
It was, I think, for him, a personal shock of recognition. Who am I? Am I an American? What does it mean for me to be an American?
If you look at Fred Korematsu, you see a very ordinary man who just wanted to be left alone, but who defied the United States government because he knew it was wrong.
Some names of ordinary citizens stand for millions of souls. Plessy, Brown, Parks. To that distinguished list, today we add the name of Fred Korematsu.
So I hope you will all sign up for that program and the programs to come. Shula, please take it away for the audience Q&A.
This is a question from Miriam Rosenblum. Riza Palatnik's incarceration was the impetus for which the original London women formed the 35s. Can you verify that? And can you share the rest of her story? Who would like to answer that one? Maybe you, Sharon? Do you know? No.
I'm afraid I don't know.
That's okay.
I can possibly help, Sheila. Reza eventually made Alia. She was released and eventually made it to Israel in the 1980s and was able to join her sister and her parents there. And her sister Katya appears in our film. She's now, very impressive woman, very articulate woman, and sadly Reza passed away a few years ago.
Thank you.
She was a librarian, by the way, and Katya said she couldn't name a book that she hadn't read.
So many of these comments are just ringing with echoes in today's new attitude towards books. Were non-Jews involved in the 35s movement? Lynn Jones is asking. Sharon, do you know?
I didn't know specifically. In Ireland, when I was there, the 35s were Jewish women. However, there was our desire was actually to bring in more people to take it to the wider community, as I said. So we certainly had support from people from the wider non-Jewish community. But in terms of the 35s themselves, I think that in Ireland, they were all Jewish women.
Jana, anything to add to that?
I don't know specifically about the 35s, but I do know that the French Committee of 15, probably half of them were not Jewish. They just felt that this is the right cause to do social action. And some of the American organizations, most of the participants were Jewish, but some were not. As a matter of fact, I was on Ted Kennedy's list of refuseniks, and he wasn't Jewish. And yet he was extremely effective in getting refuseniks out.
And Roger, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, yes. Whilst it was driven by Jews, there were certainly non-Jews, Gentiles involved with it. Jane Fonda very famously went to the Soviet Union to campaign for the release of one person, and then joined her Ida Nudel when she was eventually freed and allowed to make it to Israel. Jane Fonda flew specifically to Israel to greet her there. But as it happens, I grew up just south of London, and there was a place called Keston College, which was run by a man called Michael Bordeaux, and it was a Christian initiative. And that was all about promoting the rights of oppressed Soviet citizens. And he very definitely aligned himself with the Jewish movement for the Soviet Jewry.
So we have an answer to this question. Thank you. Here is another one. People like to show in their comments here, not just questions, but how they had a connection with the Soviet Jewry movement. And another theme is some of the people are tying in what happened then with what is happening now with regard to anti-Israel and sympathies with the Palestinians. And Mark Neuberger Thornhill from Ontario, Canada says, if the Irish seemed to be supportive of the freedom of Soviet Jewry, can anyone explain why today the opposite is true? That is, Ireland seems to be increasingly anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. Sharon, I always turn to you first because you know a lot about this.
Well, I am looking at the response that Maria McCarthy wrote in the chat, and I agree with her completely. I don't see the Irish as being anti-Semitic. When we were there was certainly not a sense of anti-Semitism. There was always actually a great interest in things Jewish, particularly if you were a religious Jew, because at that time the Irish were quite religious Catholics. But it is absolutely true that they tend to have very strong sympathies with the people who they see as victims. And that has a lot to do with the way they feel that they were victims to the British behavior towards the Irish. And therefore, there is a tradition of the Irish supporting Palestinians as victims. It's actually very interesting. You see in Northern Ireland that the Protestants tend to support Israel, the Catholics support the Palestinians, and that is, I think, what we're seeing now, a great sense of sympathy for Palestinians who they see as victims.
We are getting to the end of the hour, so I do want to give our speakers a chance to make some final remarks, including you, Shulamit. We'll get to you.
Thank you.
But I would like to start now with Jenna. What would you like to say today in closing?
This is a wonderful event. What I want to say is that let's keep these memories and documents alive. When I first left the Soviet Union, everybody knew about refuseniks. And, 5 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, whenever I would give a talk about refuseniks, I was asked to footnote refuseniks. What is that word? What does it mean? Even if I was speaking to Jewish communities. History lives for as long as we are alive. But the more we create of those records, films, documentary footages, interviews, diaries, that will then remain. And it is our responsibility to keep that history alive. This is one generation. We are not even talking about the turn of the centuries, 1901. We are talking about our lifetimes. That history needs to be preserved.
Thank you, Jana. Sharon, what would you like to say today in closing to our audience?
For me, Judaism is very much about awareness and appreciation. And when I returned from the Soviet Union, I was so much more aware of the difficulties others have to suffer and how privileged I was to live in a democracy where I could practice my religion freely. And I believe that that's something that we must never take for granted. I could say much more, but I see time is very short, so I will leave it there.
Roger, thanks for such a beautiful film. And please tell us what you would like to say in closing.
Well, what a privilege it is to have this platform. Thank you to the Susan Mendez Foundation for allowing me to share this platform as well with such impressive women, Jana and Sharon. Thank you. Somebody mentioned at the beginning the idea of the righteous people, the 36 righteous people, and the Lamed Vovnik, I think is the expression, isn't it? And I guess Aristides de Sousa Mendes was one of those. But I think the message from this film is that perhaps we all are one of those, and why not act as if you are? There's a line from one of the 35s at the end of the film when she says, if there's one thing that you can do, do it. And I think that's the message that I took from this film, that it's a call to all of us, and it's a historical story, but it should be one that resonates for all of us now. And it's been a privilege for me to tell it.
Thank you, Roger. Shula, the last word goes to you.
Okay. I want to just mention two things, I think. One is I just finished writing a book about the Holocaust. It's called Hiding in Holland, and it's based on all sorts of papers that I found in my parents' house, many written by my father. But what he tells me in this is that as Jews in Europe during the time of the Holocaust were deprived of the opportunities to practice their religion, which is what Sharon talked about, they started to clamor for learning. The first thing that people did when they were deprived of everything was to start learning. They learned Hebrew. That was, numero uno. And I love the part that Jana showed us, or Sharon, I'm not sure, about how these groups set up to be Upan. I mean, of all things, to start learning a foreign language when you're being persecuted, it's kind of an interesting thing. So I see these different events occurring. The other thing is, I just want to tell a story with respect about Natan Sharansky, who is very much a symbol, not the only one, of course, of this Free Soviet Jewry movement. And it was, I think, in 9 years, he was in solitary confinement. He has a lot to teach us about how to deal with oppression. So at Brandeis, 1 year, I think it was 92, 93, I wanted to create a session on women and freedom. And not one session, a whole series throughout the year. And Natan Sharansky was a guest professor at Brandeis that year. So I thought, perfect. I'll go up to Natan Sharansky and I said, tell us about women and the Free Soviet Jewry movement. And he looked at me, and I say this with respect, with complete confusion. He didn't understand what that role was. Maybe he was thinking of the Brezhnev and Ford. I have no idea. But I said, Natan, how about your wife? Did she go to the UN and try to get you out? Did she do this? Did she do that? How about your mother? And just close to home. And he said, oh my God. And he had a consciousness raising moment there. So I don't want to harp on this theme, but we know Babi Yar, story of Yevtushenko, and we know all the guys. And we have to know the women, because if we do, that will inspire other women to follow in their footsteps.
Great. Well, there's so much more to say. Obviously, we've just scratched the surface of a big, big topic. So thank you again to our wonderful panelists, my dear friend, moderator Shulamit Reinhardt, and of course, all of you who come so faithfully. I wish you a good Passover, a good Easter, whatever it is you celebrate, or nothing. And we'll see you again on May 4th. So have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.